Imagine a world bustling with life, streets alive with laughter, markets overflowing with goods, and every corner echoing with the sounds of daily routines. This was 14th century Europe, a continent teeming with people, ideas, and ambition. Then, in the blink of an eye, up to half its people vanished within just a few short years, leaving behind empty homes and silent towns. This isn't a tale spun from imagination. It's the grim reality of the Black Death, a catastrophe that swept across Europe in the mid-1300s. Between 1347 and 1351, an estimated 25 million people perished, claimed by a microscopic invader that no one could see, let alone understand. The Black Death didn't just kill, it shattered the very foundations of European society, forcing a reckoning with everything people thought they knew. The loss was beyond comprehension. No border, class, or age was spared. Entire families disappeared and communities were left in ruins. Kings, peasants, priests, merchants, everyone was vulnerable. The plague cared nothing for wealth or power. Its reach was absolute. Cities emptied, villages vanished, and the living were haunted by the memory of those lost. The world felt as if it had been turned upside down. This was more than a health crisis. It was an existential shock that shook the very soul of Europe. The Black Death forced people to question everything, their faith, their leaders, and even their place in the universe. Old certainties crumbled. To truly understand this catastrophe, we must look east, to the vast grasslands of Central Asia, where a deadly bacterium waited patiently for its chance to spread. The story of the plague is a tangled web of biology, trade, and human reaction, a chain reaction that toppled old powers and opened the door to new possibilities. The Europe that emerged from the ashes was scarred but also transformed. Out of disaster, a new era began to take shape, a renaissance born from unimaginable loss. This is the story of how a tiny, invisible organism forever altered the course of human history, reshaping the world in ways no one could have foreseen. Our story begins on the vast windswept steppes of Central Asia, a land of endless grasslands and roaming herds. Here, in this remote wilderness, a microscopic killer was quietly at work, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would one day change the course of history. For centuries, this deadly bacterium cycled silently among wild rodents and the fleas that infested them, rarely making the leap to humans. Life continued undisturbed, as nature maintained a delicate balance between predator and prey, microbe and host. But the 13th and 14th centuries brought unprecedented connection, as trade routes expanded and distant worlds drew closer together. The Mongol Empire's vast trade network, the legendary Silk Road, became a superhighway for goods, people, and, unknowingly, for disease. Caravans laden with silk, spices, and precious cargo crossed continents, linking east and west as never before. Environmental shifts, including climate changes and expanding settlements, pushed rodents ever closer to human communities. This allowed Yersinia pestis to break free from its natural cycle and find new opportunities for transmission. Fleas, searching for new hosts, found black rats thriving in the bustling towns and merchant caravans. These adaptable rodents flourished in the shadows of human civilization, multiplying rapidly. These rats, stowaways on the great trade routes, carried the plague westward, hidden among sacks of goods and supplies, unseen but deadly. By the 1340s, the disease had reached the bustling Black Sea trading posts like Kaffa, a vital link between Asia and Europe. During a Mongol siege in 1346, a desperate act unfolded. Infected corpses were catapulted over the city walls, one of history's earliest acts of biological warfare, spreading terror and disease among the defenders. As panic spread, Genoese merchants and sailors fled the besieged city, boarding ships in hopes of escape. But they carried more than just memories. They brought the plague with them. Their vessels, infested with rats and fleas, became floating incubators of death, carrying the invisible enemy across the waves. Soon, the ports of Europe would face the devastating consequences, as the Black Death began its relentless march across the continent. When Genoese ships arrived in Messina in 1347, they brought more than cargo. They brought the plague. Unbeknownst to the sailors and townsfolk, these ships carried a deadly stowaway that would change the course of European history forever. The black rat, Rattus rattus, was everywhere in medieval Europe, thriving in the bustling cities and crowded ports. These nimble creatures scurried through streets, homes, and warehouses. perfectly adapted to life alongside humans and ideal for spreading disease. But the true culprit was the flea, Xenopsilla chiopus, living on rat blood. These tiny parasites were nearly invisible, yet they played a massive role in the unfolding disaster. Fleas bit infected rats, ingested Yersinia pestis, and then bit humans, regurgitating bacteria into their bloodstream. This microscopic bacterium was the invisible killer, passing silently from animal to person. This was the main route for bubonic plague, marked by painful swollen buboes, horrific lumps that appeared suddenly, signaling the onset of a terrifying illness. If the infection reached the lungs, it became pneumonic plague, spread by coughs and sneezes, far deadlier and more contagious. Now, the disease could leap from person to person with terrifying speed. Person-to-person transmission let the plague race through crowded cities, even in winter, when rats and fleas were less active. No season offered safety. The bacterium could also survive on contaminated clothes and bedding, making trade goods another vector. Everyday objects became silent threats, carrying death from one household to the next. Fleas hid in textiles, waiting for new hosts. Even the simple act of putting on a cloak or lying in bed could bring infection. Handling the belongings of the sick or dead was extremely risky. Families, neighbors, and caretakers all faced danger simply by trying to help or mourn. This perfect storm, rat to flea to human, human to human, and contaminated objects, let the Black Death saturate Europe. The disease spread with relentless efficiency, leaving devastation in its wake. The speed and reach of the plague seemed supernatural to those who lived through it. Entire communities were struck down in days, leaving survivors bewildered and terrified. No one was truly safe. The sense of dread was everywhere, as people watched friends and family fall ill with no warning. The invisible enemy moved faster than anyone could imagine, reshaping society and haunting Europe for generations to come. The plague's arrival turned vibrant cities into silent tombs. Major centers like Florence, Paris, and London lost up to 70% of their people. Imagine 7 out of 10 friends, neighbors, and family gone. Daily life collapsed. Fear and chaos reigned. People abandoned loved ones, and even doctors and priests died in droves. The dead overwhelmed the living. Individual graves gave way to mass pits. Traditional burial rites vanished. Bodies were layered in earth, forgotten. Survivors faced immense psychological trauma and despair. Chroniclers like Boccaccio described lawlessness, isolation, and wild abandon. Fleeing the cities only spread the disease further, igniting new outbreaks. The plague struck rich and poor alike, but crowded, unsanitary cities suffered most. Entire households vanished in days. Homes were sealed, marked as tombs. The silence and stench of death haunted every street. The Black Death left cities forever changed. Before the plague, Europe's feudal system thrived on abundant, cheap labor. The Black Death shattered this balance, wiping out much of the workforce. Suddenly, labor, not land, became Europe's most valuable commodity. Surviving peasants gained bargaining power, demanding higher wages and better conditions. If one lord refused, they could move to another. Mobility was revolutionary. Wages soared, and many peasants enjoyed unprecedented prosperity. Ruling classes tried to fight back with laws like England's Statute of Laborers, but these failed. Landowners shifted to less labor-intensive agriculture like sheep ranching, boosting the wool industry. The old feudal order crumbled, replaced by cash rents and wage labor. The Black Death accelerated economic modernization, paving the way for a new society. Wealth was no longer tied solely to land, but to capital and labor. The social hierarchy was upended. Europe's economy would never be the same. Out of devastation came opportunity and change. The Black Death shattered religious certainty. Why would God allow such suffering? The church, once the bedrock of meaning, seemed powerless. Prayers and relics failed. Priests died alongside their flocks. Some became more devout, joining movements like the Flagellants who whipped themselves in public penance. Others lost faith, questioning the church's authority and wealth. Thousands of clergy died, leaving a vacuum filled by inexperienced replacements. This crisis planted seeds for future upheaval, including the Reformation. In desperation, people sought scapegoats. Jewish communities were falsely accused and massacred. The search for meaning turned to violence and prejudice. The plague exposed the fragility of faith and the darkness of fear. The trauma of the Black Death transformed European art and thought. Pre-plague art was serene. After it fixated on death, skeletons, decay, the dance macabre. Death became the great equalizer in paintings and woodcuts. Medicine, too, was forced to change. The plague exposed the limits of ancient theories. Doctors began to rely on observation and dissection. This shift toward empirical evidence laid the groundwork for modern medicine. Public health innovation followed. Italian cities pioneered quarantine, requiring ships to wait offshore for 40 days. Lazarettos, or plague hospitals, were established. These pragmatic responses marked the birth of public health. The intellectual landscape shifted as well. Humanism emerged, focusing on individual experience and potential. The seeds of the Renaissance were sown in the aftermath of the plague. Out of darkness, a new era of creativity and inquiry began. The Black Death wasn't a one-time disaster, it returned in waves for centuries. Recurring outbreaks kept Europe's population low and labor valuable. Life expectancy was uncertain, families were smaller and society more cautious. Communities adapted, refining quarantine and public health measures. The fear of plague became part of culture, folklore, and even children's rhymes. Despite repeated devastation, Europe endured and adapted. Fewer mouths meant more resources for survivors, raising living standards. The decline of feudalism continued, replaced by a dynamic, market-based economy. This long adaptation forged a resilient, innovative society. The crucible of plague shaped the path to the modern era. The Black Death was more than a catastrophe, it was a turning point. It shattered old systems, empowered new classes, and fueled the rise of capitalism and the Renaissance. Innovation in agriculture, medicine, and public health followed. Art and thought shifted to focus on the human condition and the value of life. The plague's legacy paved the way for science, individualism, and complex economies. Its story is a humbling lesson. A tiny organism can reshape civilization. The echoes of the Black Death remind us of our vulnerability and our resilience.